Oil, like many other industries, began in a century of innovation. After speculations about its ability to serve as a well-needed cheap illuminant were scientifically validated, an application of similar salt drilling techniques led to the invention of the oil well. The first real semblances of a petroleum business emerged in the northeastern United States, and especially Pennsylvania, around the 1860s. This came just in time for the entry of the American Gilded Age, an era in which technological development aligned with the peak of unchecked capitalism and caused many ambitious entrepreneurs to seek and achieve great fortunes. The entrepreneur of this story was John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. Standard managed to starve or buy out the competition by asking railroad companies for special rebates or charging less for their oil in certain regions to force others into net losses. This is the capitalist equivalent of a war crime. Local producers did fight back against this, notably with protests and a pipeline, but Standard simply had more stamina. Rockefeller also managed to capitalize on a smaller yet not insignificant discovery of oil near the states of Indiana and Ohio, and after a German chemist found out a way to remove the odd sulfuric odor, this allowed Standard to take part in the raw production process that they had originally avoided. All seemed to be going well, but it wasn't. Standard had, by this point, achieved a worldwide monopoly, but problems arose with trying to dominate global supply through only one region. For many of their European consumers, there was a market for production closer to home, which was found in the Russian Caucasus. The Swedish Nobels and Jewish Rothschilds built sizable oil businesses in the region. The latter of those families even worked with British distributors of the same religion to perform a global coup of oil by securing a trade route through the Suez Canal and towards an East Asian market of hundreds of millions. Any chance Standard had to assemble a global monopoly passed, and by the early 20th century, there wasn't even a way to hold on to the domestic market. New oil scenes emerged in California, Kansas, and most importantly, Texas. After an Austrian immigrant managed to find a gusher's worth of oil near the town of Beaumont, a new boom in the Lone Star State had begun. The Texan oil industry was, similarly to the state itself, wild, successful, and big. A plethora of discoveries along the US Gulf Coast which fell out of the corporation's hand put the nail in the coffin for Standard's domestic monopoly. All of a sudden, a deep expose of the firm's shady business dealings as well as a new wave of progressive politics led to the company's dismantling by nobody less than the US Supreme Court, although many of the corporations carved out of Standard ended up being successful themselves. Still, international markets opened up, and although political instability caused the decline of Russian oil, the Dutch East Indies proved to be the next big hit. Even mighty American corporations were impressed by the progress here. They especially loved the atrocious working conditions and exploitation of the natives. The most successful of these producers was Royal Dutch, who outpaced and partnered their way through local competition and managed amalgamation with aforementioned British distributors to form the international titan that was Royal Dutch Shell. Last and probably least was the Anglo-Persian Company. One British businessman was granted an oil concession in most of Persia by the Shah, and the Persians were so happy to see him that they revolted against the government. Early on, that expedition ran into problems that lay in the land itself. After their finances barely endured a desperate search with poor logistics, they finally hit a limited amount of oil. Their venture would most likely have financially collapsed were it not for the saving grace of the Royal Navy. Many in the British Admiralty saw the virtues of oil-powered ships, and after the transition was made, Anglo-Persian needed to advertise. They were pitched as the only true British option, compared with the untrustable foreign conglomerates that were their competition. With the help of a certain Winston Churchill, they won overwhelming support in Parliament just 11 days before an Austrian Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo. The utility of oil was almost undisputable after the role it played in the First World War. At the very beginning of the conflict, it saw use in France after being employed to fuel a taxi transport division and quickly moving Allied troops from Paris to the front lines they were needed in, although their role in that battle is somewhat exaggerated. A new armed and armored vehicle powered by oil was also deployed, the tank. First conceived by the idea of attaching a machine gun to a tractor by, of course, an Australian, because only the Australians would be insane enough to look at a tractor and think it could be improved by attaching a machine gun. Tanks proved to be a critical factor in breaking the defensive stalemate and softening up front lines, but they weren't the only major innovation of World War I powered by oil. The aeroplane, initially used for exclusively reconnaissance, then evolved to arming pilots with small to medium-sized firearms, and finally developed mounted guns on the planes themselves. They saw their production rise to the thousands by the end of the war, and also proved viable as a new mode of civilian transportation. This war saw the restructuring of the relationship between oil companies and the government. Partnership of the industry and administrations was the new order of the day. This coordination greatly helped to ease the pressure of petroleum businesses to meet their increasing demands. Production now needed to be adequate enough to feed civilian needs, the military, and war facilities. With that said, the Allies certainly outpaced the Germans in the metric of oil supply. The Central Powers only had two major regions of oil production in sight, Romania and the Caucasus, neither of which were in their control pre-war. Both of these places were eventually captured, but not before the Allies made extensive and successful efforts to sabotage their oil fields, which may have made the difference in the critical moments of 1918. After the dust had settled and war was over, a booming civilian industry kept petroleum companies busy. The motorization of American culture and spread of oil-fueled automobiles got to a point at which there was one car for every 5 Americans. The places where these cars were refueled ended up becoming buffets of petroleum products, such as tires, batteries, motor oil, or even vacuum cleaners. The loose de facto alliance of successors to Standard Oil was finally decomposing, and the death of monopoly was naturally the rebirth of competition. With these changes in the market, there was also a pessimistic and somewhat scientifically backed worry that the country might run out of oil, which was completely wrong. In reality, by the latter half of the 1920s there was too much supply, especially after the discovery of a large field in East Texas, and prices plummeted. Calls for regulation grew, but directly through the government, that would be too authoritarian. Instead, states like Texas have come up with great, well-thought-out and carefully planned solutions like sending in the military. Although the military did, funnily enough, work, oil businesses soon realized by the early 1930s that it was time for government intervention, and this change in attitude came with pretty good timing. The incoming Roosevelt administration was far more willing to consider federal involvement, and a regulatory network as well as price controls helped to stabilize the scene. Globally, transnational oil corporations moved towards negotiations and dialogue to stand united against political climates increasingly hostile to big business. Communist and leftist governments in places like Mexico and Russia moved against what they saw as exploitative practices of petroleum companies and towards nationalization. Even though these countries displayed some willingness to compromise, the corporate world stubbornly shut them out on ideological grounds. Especially in nations like Mexico, many worried that softness would encourage similar policies in other Latin American markets such as Venezuela, and Mexican oil was all but left to a rather large state-owned firm. The next frontier for oil, however, was in the Middle East. The race for land and drilling concessions in the tomb of the Ottoman Empire between the British, French, Americans, and even an Armenian businessman was settled in the Sykes-Picot and Red Line agreements. American corporations, Anglo-Persian and Royal Dutch Shell, were to limit their Middle Eastern oil operations to only be carried out through the jointly owned Turkish Petroleum Company. Local Arab rulers proved welcoming towards these ventures, with many hoping that drillers might also find an extremely rare and valuable substance known as water. Companies didn't even know if there was oil to be found in the region, but the benefit of the doubt was earned after discoveries in Bahrain and Eastern Arabia were made from 1932 onwards. Soon, businesses were scrambling for oil concessions. Even a few fascist regimes got themselves involved. Oh yeah, speaking of those fascist regimes. Despite its entry into the industrialized and westernized worlds, Japan often felt internationally excluded. Expansive and militaristic tendencies that the island had always maintained bred uneasiness among foreigners, but the nation's thriving democratic and parliamentary system helped to quiet those doubts. Yet pluralistic political culture soon ended up sidetracked by the emergence of intense nationalism as well as a desire to found Japan's unique imperial way from which the rest of East Asia could be molded around. This, compounded with the Japanese archipelago's relative lack of vital resources and the army's immense political sway, put the empire on a path to war. One of their first targets was China, who everyone knew had wronged the Japanese people immensely by doing nothing. The initiation of the Sino-Japanese War was met with almost universal disapproval abroad, as much as 70% of the American public favoring action against the aggressor. Japan could not afford to brush this aside. They still heavily relied on Dutch, British, and American imports, especially oil. US President Roosevelt was inclined towards settling differences not on the battlefield, particularly to avoid alienating reasonable voices in the empire, but peace proved difficult when each side viewed itself as surrounded. Japan saw a looming disaster through the degradation of relations with the West, which would fatally cut off their access to war materials if embargoes came through. The USA saw rising threats in Europe and Asia as Japan drew ever closer with Nazi Germany, and soon they would be trapped between a Pacific monster and a European one. After Japan invaded French Indochina and the US issued a near-total embargo of oil in the years of 1940 and 41 respectively, the Allies were almost certain that an imperial strike was coming towards their Southeast Asian territories, which it was. However, that came not before a far more unexpected Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor, one devastating to the US Navy. Japan proceeded to sweep through Indonesia, the Philippines, Burma, and a string of Pacific territories. With the seizure of Royal Dutch fields, it might appear that the oil situation was stabilized, but it actually ended up becoming their greatest weakness. Since most Japanese territories were controlled overseas, the US Navy had no problem disrupting the empire's supply lines. Tightening of Japanese oil reserves heavily restricted the mobility of the Navy and Air Force in the wake of the unstoppable yet slow advance of the US island-hopping campaign. They fought desperately on, cracking down on civilian oil use and persevering through attacks on the home island. With the US simply unwilling to face incredible Japanese innovations of warfare such as schoolchildren armed with bamboo, they initiated an aerial bombing campaign, which concluded in the detonation of nuclear missiles upon imperial cities. Japan's European ally, Nazi Germany, also had a pre-war quest to secure oil, a quest which they had two solutions to. One was the process of synthesizing it from coal, but production from such refineries never met the army's vast needs. These factories, many of which were fueled by slave labor from the camps, were also targets of Allied strategic bombing later in the war, further hindering their utility. The second solution was the conquest of the Soviet Union. After his initial eastern invasion failed due to overextension, Hitler began experimenting with new war strategies such as going insane. The Nazi Caucasus offensive was so poorly thought out that the Germans considered any Russian resistance to be an afterthought, with some in high command having plans of rolling their tank divisions through the Middle East into India? In reality, that afterthought managed to encircle and destroy German armies in the bloody Battle of Stalingrad, and from that point on, oil supply continued to impede the Axis and privilege the Allies. Similar problems of supply and overextension halted Rommel's African campaign. So how did the Allies manage to maintain overwhelming superiority in the petroleum front? The Americans were the clear breadwinner. Efforts towards conservation and rationing secured sufficiency of supply. Transferring this to the European theater proved difficult, however. While pipelines made land transportation from the refineries to ports easier, German submarines continued to hinder shipments overseas. The cracking of the U-boat code and innovations in the storage and transportation of oil finally gave trade convoys some breathing room around 1943, something which the Germans were rarely afforded. From start to finish, the Allies almost always outperformed the Axis in oil. It's no surprise they ended up drawing the borders at the end of the Second World War. With the world embroiled in blood and war, Arabian oil was practically forgotten in the 1940s. Yet even the small number of geologists left here found it easy to confirm the region's massive potential. There was clear evidence that Arabia was more than just another new frontier, and the USA wanted in. Attempts at independent involvement were made into an uphill battle by the extensive and competitive British influence over the region, so an agreement between the British and Americans was signed. This federal attempt to establish itself as a player, and therefore competitor in the industry, was met with almost immediate backlash from American Domestic Oil, who managed to mount enough political opposition in Washington to unravel the whole arrangement. Private industry now turned towards the region, and the first order of business was the renegotiation of the existing dominant and restrictive Red Line Agreement. After legal battles with the French were won by diplomatic adjustments and promises to preserve the, now Iraqi, Petroleum company won leniency from its Armenian founder, concessions in the Persian Gulf were dished out. American businesses set up Aramco in Saudi Arabia, and Royal Dutch Shell collaborated with American Gulf Oil through a business in Kuwait. Top it off with the assembly of sufficient pipeline and tanker infrastructure, and the oil was flowing. Obviously, new petroleum needed new markets, which were found in Europe. After World War II, the continent was in financial ruin, materials were in short supply, and the British even implemented drastic measures such as not starving Indians. Americans and Europeans worked together via Marshall and recovery plans to secure a stable supply of oil which could withstand volatile politics, and changes in the market, which was done with remarkable efficiency. Speaking of volatile politics, Israel. Arab governments soon threatened to compromise oil infrastructure and drilling rights to weaponize supply shortages against Western support for Israel. But in reality, nobody was in a position to endanger their oil profits. Clashes between government and oil businesses ended up very common in the 1950s through 60s. Nations argued that they themselves had fought for and earned their land, and corporations had no right to steal profits they could only make because of generous concessions. Companies argued that they had made money where there used to be none, and the governments had done nothing to start demanding higher shares from areas they already signed away. The front line of this conflict began in Venezuela, where dictatorship had been dissolved and the Liberal Socialist Party was in charge. A 50-50 profit split system between private industry and government was established to some protest, but this model was soon adopted elsewhere and consensus upon its validity was achieved. Still, some nations wanted more. Iran seized control of its industry from a British Empire which had become the perfect unifying bogeyman for a nation with divided politics. Anglo-American intelligence agencies staged a coup in 1953 to put a slightly friendlier Shah back in power, and although Iranian oil was kept national, supervision was provided by a consortium of American and British companies. This event probably provided inspiration for a certain Gamal Abdel Nasser to occupy the Suez Canal, sparking a crisis in a key avenue for oil shipment. The British, French, and Israelis staged swift military intervention, but these nations soon found themselves brought to their knees after the US told them not to do that. Countries could stand up to businesses and their interests. The Persians once again started pushing their shares of the 50-50 agreement in deals with Italian and Japanese newcomers to the industry. Private price wars with Soviet oil proved to exporting countries the volatility and recklessness of the business, and once again inspired by politicians in Venezuela, they tried to stand unified in their attempts to gain larger shares through the foundation of OPEC. But due to lasting tensions between many members, this unity was hardly achieved, and the simple abundance of oil discoveries during this era allowed businesses to ignore their demands and cut their losses in less difficult countries, such as Algeria and Libya. These nations were just one example of the global trend of petrol in the 1950s through 60s, an increase in consumption, largely due to the death of coal. Oil simply proved to be better than its rocky predecessor. Its industry wasn't as heavily unionized, its prices were lower and oversupply drove them lower, and it didn't try to give you a lung disease for breathing. Wow! In just America, the population was suburbanized, travel by car connected the country, highways were built, and the life of the motorist was idolized by pop culture. Oil was a miracle product, a titan in global economics, revolutionizing civilization and politics wherever it went. Nothing could stop it, right? Like everything else in the Middle East, one of the first questions Arabs asked about oil was how to weaponize it against Israel. Western oil supply seemed increasingly vulnerable to the politics of an unstable region. Britain had long taken on the task of preserving and negotiating stability in the Middle East, a task that ended in the retreat from the Gulf in 1971. Around the same time, America stopped producing an oil surplus. Global petroleum supply seemed all the less able to withstand disruptions, not even to mention the complicated coexistence between oil and the environmentalist movement, a major factor in determining what energy sources fell out of favor. The debate between nations and corporations went dormant for the better half of the 1960s, but was reignited when a coup in Libya put Muammar Gaddafi in charge. Many companies had made the mistake of developing a dependence on the country's oil, and they were forced to comply with the revolutionary leader's demands, not least of which was partial nationalization. The 50-50 split was done away with in the agreements of Tripoli and Tehran, and governments raised their shares to 55%. That number would hardly see any longevity. Arab states soon preoccupied themselves with new but not unrelated matters. After their close defeat in the Yom Kippur War, Middle Eastern OPEC members utilized their domination of oil supply against Western support for Israel. Production cuts as well as strict control on exports sent shockwaves through unprepared markets. Vulnerable countries had their economies thrown completely off balance, and companies scrambled to equally distribute to an unequally embargoed world. The crisis could finally be called over after diplomatic breakthroughs between Israelis and Arabs, Americans and Europeans, as well as with the Middle East and industrial world. Still, reckless and complacent oil use was done away with in the wake of skyrocketing prices. Efficiency standards and limits on consumption were implemented. The life of a motorist went from being an idol to a liability. Countries did everything they could to lower their reliance on the Middle East, and discoveries in Alaska, Mexico, and the North Sea provided plenty of room for this diversification, made all the more pressing by a trend of nationalization and undoing of concession agreements in the OPEC sphere. Although many would see this as the heyday of the organization, two countries were not particularly enthusiastic about high prices: Iran, after some American persuasion, and Saudi Arabia. Speaking of Iran, massive student strikes, dissatisfaction among the Shia clergy, and the paralyzing of the army spelt the end of the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah personally found getting deposed to be very tiring, and would soon fly out of the country to dedicate the rest of his life to dying. Iran soon cut oil exports. General panic preceded this, and businesses started stockpiling supply. The 1979 oil shock also came in several waves, the second being general anxiety in the light of the Iranian hostage crisis, and the third being the cutting of supplies from both nations involved in the Iran-Iraq war. OPEC rolled out even higher price increases, but this time they really overestimated themselves. The shortages of the 1970s didn't damage the supply-demand balance, but did harm efficient global petroleum flow. This really did nothing but diminish and stigmatize an industry that had been so dominant throughout prior decades. The scramble and instability of this time loosened the dominant position of major oil corporations, and independent producers saw a resurgence. As big players moved to the unstable spot market, rampant mergers and acquisitions dominated this period of the industry. Disappointments in Alaska and a Mexican debt crisis pushed companies to search for oil not in the ground, but in the stock exchange where it could be safely bought. As the 1980s arrived, so did the realization that high prices were simply detrimental to the business, and one kingdom had predicted this all too well. The Saudis soon did away with production mandates and let the market decide the value of oil. Thankfully, the market made a rational, well-calculated, and carefully chosen decision to throw the price off a cliff. This new crash was hated by sellers and loved by buyers. Any remaining worries of permanent shortages were consumed by the viciousness and unpredictability of 1980s booming capitalism. Eventually, a moderate $18 set price for oil was agreed upon. Oil was no longer something that had to be viciously battled over. No longer was it strategically utilized at every opportunity, and no longer did it revolutionize civilization and politics wherever it went. Private industry was even let back in, and most were satisfied. Well, most were. Two major developments in global politics and the oil industry preluded the 1990s. The opening up of former Soviet oil to international markets and Iraq's bid for mastery in the Gulf War. If Saddam Hussein did manage to conquer and Iraqize Kuwait, it would have enlarged his share of global oil reserves by 10%. Stopping that scenario was big on the agenda for Western leaders, but after they did, oil didn't seem too much of a worry. As the dominoes of the Asian financial crisis fell hard on the developing world, consumption collapsed and abundance arrived, as did comfort for producers. This led to less need for new exploration. It was becoming more costly to do so anyways, and as production from Venezuela and Nigeria was halted, an oil price that slowly built up to $147 from 2003 to 2008. It seems that oil security will never be permanent, but perhaps this is simply a manifestation of the world oil is bought and sold in. State-owned companies are still the biggest players in the industry, even when compared to supermajors like ExxonMobil, and this allows geopolitical trends to reflect upon the business. Speaking of global trends, climate change. Innovation, advancement, investment, and research are going to be necessary to accommodate for this new crisis, on top of billions more consumers being integrated from India and China. One new development that might help ease the latter of those demands is the S Shale Oil Revolution. With big corporations preoccupied by offshore oil prospects, smaller drilling companies of the 2000s were ushering in a new age in American energy on land. Producers soon found a multitude of viable shale formations in a diverse range of states such as Texas, not Texas, and most importantly, Texas. This new revolution satisfied the Texans greatly, especially as it brought large investment and angered environmentalists. Opposition to this revolution is coming primarily from the green lobby. Everything about it from pipelines to fracking has been politicized. Regardless, shale continues to be a great boon to America's global position, bringing them back as one of the world's largest petroleum producers and giving plenty of new leverage in trade negotiations. Shale has covered the costs of flexibility in America's foreign policy. This revolution even spread to their southern neighbor, although reversing developments towards privatization and rebuilding state oil as a national symbol is high on the agenda for the most recent Mexican government elected in 2018. Backtracking recent privatization isn't particularly unique to Mexico. Since Putin's 2000 election victory, Russia has seen considerable reassertion of national control over the economy, with ever-increasing oil prices, and therefore revenues for Russia seeming to validate this shift. Yet domestic politics are not the only thing of importance. Europe is one of the biggest consumers of Russian oil, but EU ideals of competitive and flexible energy providers are somewhat misaligned with the Kremlin's aims to seize more control over pipeline infrastructure and the flow of oil, as well as over its neighbors. After Russia cut off earmarked petroleum exports to punish Ukraine for holding elections, the two nations have been on a collision course towards war over the identity of that region. When armed hostilities and Russian annexations came in 2014, Western sanctions were soon issued. The Russian economy was stripped of any space for reform, shale developments were halted, and a string of state-backed projects now seem to be the future of the nation's growth. This has also caused Moscow to commit towards a more eastern focus and into a strategic, albeit strenuous, partnership with China. Beijing's ability to supply the massive demand of its population for oil especially relies on security and control in one region, the South China Sea. This part of the Pacific Ocean is important for all sorts of reasons: fishing rights, global trade, offshore energy prospects, and a legal battle for all of these things is being fought over the definition of international waters and EEZs. Naval standoffs, which have become more frequent in recent years, show that China is willing to support its sizable claims, backed up by convincing Chinese arguments such as fake islands. The PRC and most nations in the East Asian region don't have adequate local supplies of oil, making the security of commerce in the sea all the more important a factor in the social and economic stability of the area. China has a fight set out for it, as what used to be a merely difficult relationship with the US is now becoming an outright rivalry. President Xi Jinping has already unveiled ambitious plans to restructure the world economy through the Belt and Road Initiative. For many nations, energy, infrastructure, and political investment combined with China's remarkable flexibility in working with democracies and dictatorships alike, and contrasted with the retreat of often unwelcome US influence, makes this a very attractive deal. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the borders it drew have become synonymous with the frustration and instability of the Middle East. No doubt, one of the region's greatest sources of conflict is the fact a 100-year-old colonial border has endured throughout decolonization, Nasserism, Arab nationalism, jihadism, and anything else the area threw at it to define, without care for ethnicity or culture, the modern nation-states of Arabia. However, the border doesn't stop some of those nation-states from trying to dominate the region. Iraq tried, was stopped, got invaded, and collapsed, but the ruins of their failure were soon turned into a battleground for the next two competitors. The Cold War between revolutionary Iran and a Saudi kingdom desiring regional stability can be seen wherever there is a front for it. Tehran has been able to assemble a Shia revolutionary axis of sorts from Iraq to Lebanon and at least one side in the Yemeni civil war by offering generous gifts to locals like terrorist organizations and humanitarian crises. This hasn't been unopposed. The Saudis, Israelis, and their energy are greatly threatened by this new coalition, and US sanctions have been applied. Iranian presidential elections have a fair impact on how diplomatic or confrontational the conflict is, with reformists preferring the former option and hardliners preferring the latter. This proxy war isn't the only threat to peace in the region. Widespread rejection of the Western nation-state model of national identity has led some groups to seek the establishment of a global caliphate based upon an Islamic identity. They probably won't be succeeding at that, but they are disrupting petroleum fields and trade in the region, forcing the United States and other Westerners to intervene. These two dimensions of Arab instability along with price crashes have caused some Gulf nations to question the viability of a national revenue stream built upon an unreliable oil price. Saudi Arabia is the most important of these countries seeking new incomes. Inspired by neighbors like the UAE, they are on an ambitious campaign to liberalize the nation while privatizing and diversifying the economy. Concerns over a world that was rapidly shutting itself down during the COVID pandemic caused Moscow and Riyadh to scramble for share of a quickly diminishing market via overproduction. After mediation from Washington, they cut back on this, but not soon enough to stop prices dipping so low they began paying customers to take oil out of their storage. This isn't the only cause for concern over the future of the industry. Electric cars are gaining an increasing share of the automobile market against oil-fueled gasoline vehicles, strengthened by government initiative and climate change activism. Also kickstarted by government interest was self-driving cars. The US Army showed early curiosity in automated military vehicles due to their ability to maximize laziness while invading Iraq, but driverless cars have a series of technical, legal, and moral questions to solve before becoming commercially viable. Battles in the automobile industry such as electric versus gasoline, taxis versus hailing, and driven versus automated cars are brewing, with large effects on the entrenched position oil has in that business. Still, those developments aren't as significant as the urgency of global warming. Conferences, notably the Paris Agreement in 2016, are setting the bar for how much energy companies will need to adapt or be regulated. The US, EU, and China are already rolling out ambitious plans to reduce carbon emissions. Solar, wind, and nuclear energy are advancing quickly, the first two being spearheaded by the world's largest energy consumer in Beijing. Still, petrol and other sources which may be considered dirty in the developed world can find markets in nations still suffering from energy poverty, for whom those discredited energies are seen in a much better light. You can probably see how problems arise with trying to explain how dirty and unclean oil is to households who get their energy from animal feces. Some are hoping that energy recovery from the COVID pandemic will go in a decidedly green direction, but oil is simply too important to be replaced anytime soon, especially as petroleum via plastic products has become a central part of the health system that is protecting us from this pandemic. Social, economic, and geopolitical changes over the last few years seem to leave us with few certainties for the future. But for oil, the one certainty that seems to outlast all others is uncertainty.